Hi, welcome to this first lecture of the Human Rights Lecture Series. What are human rights? Where can human rights be found? In which international legal documents? Which human rights exist? Who has human rights? And who has the obligation to respect and protect human rights? In this lecture, I will try to answer these questions in a short and concise manner. Of course, there's a lot more to say about human rights. And this is why we also provide you with additional materials and sources for further reading. If we would ask persons in the street, what are human rights? I'm sure we will get a wide variety of answers. Some might describe human rights as the rights of human beings. Others may give examples of human rights, such as non-discrimination, freedom of expression, or the right to privacy. Indeed, human rights are the rights you have simply because you are a human being. The basis of human rights is human dignity. Therefore, human rights apply to all human beings everywhere in the world. Your nationality, place of residence, sex, ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or whether you're tall, short, rich or poor, it doesn't matter. We all have human rights. Human rights are not a gift from a government or from the United Nations. They are inherent in us being human. Human rights are expressed and guaranteed by law. They are laid down in national and international legal instruments. An example of a national instrument is a constitution or a Bill of Rights. International legal instruments can take different forms. They can be hard law, which are treaties and conventions that are legally binding. They can also be soft law, which are declarations and recommendations which are not legally binding. All international legal instruments are drafted and adopted by states. They negotiate what to put in these instruments and decide whether or not they want to accept the obligations that these instruments give them. When states sign and ratify a human rights treaty, they accept these obligations and the document becomes legally binding. From that moment, states are obliged to act in certain ways or to refrain from certain acts in order to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms that are included in that treaty. One of the most well-known human rights instruments is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted after the Second World War in 1948. The Universal Declaration is translated in more than 500 languages. Where before human rights were mainly part of the domestic sphere and national constitutions, now states agreed at international level on a set of human rights and freedoms that belong to all people on earth. The goal of the Universal Declaration was to achieve universal enjoyment of human rights. And the Declaration states therefore in Article 1 that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a declaration, not a treaty, and at that time it was not meant to be legally binding. But after the Universal Declaration, numerous human rights treaties were adopted in the United Nations system. These include 9 human rights instruments that you see listed here. Now, apart from these 9 core human rights treaties, numerous declarations and recommendations on human rights have been adopted. Broadly speaking, these instruments focus on certain human rights, such as the prohibition of racial discrimination, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, or they focus on certain subjects or groups, such as children, women, or persons with disabilities. Now, why do these groups have their own treaty? They are certainly human and can therefore enjoy all the rights in the other treaties as well. However, these groups are often more vulnerable to human rights violations and at the same time less powerful to claim their rights. The 2 important comprehensive human rights treaties are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Both were adopted in 1966. Together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they form the International Bill of Human Rights. Human rights instruments are not only adopted at the global level via the United Nations. States have also adopted human rights treaties at the regional level. For instance, there is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights for Africa, the American Convention on Human Rights for the Americas, and the European Convention on Human Rights in Europe. These regional treaties are quite similar to the UN treaties, but they also reflect regional particularities. For instance, the African Charter contains not only individual, but also collective and group rights. Most human rights provisions in international legal instruments are formulated as individual rights. They state, for instance, that each person has the right to, or everyone has the freedom to. However, individuals do not live in isolation, and many rights are not only enjoyed individually, but also collectively. Examples of individual rights that are enjoyed collectively are the rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of association, or the right to take part in cultural life. But also the right to education is mostly enjoyed in a collective setting. Apart from these individual rights with a collective dimension, there are also rights of which the rights holder is not an individual, but a group, the so-called group rights. Peoples, indigenous peoples, and minorities have rights as groups, such as the right to self-determination or the right to forms of autonomy. The African Charter includes, for instance, the right of peoples to their economic, social, and cultural development in Article 21. Now let's go back to the two main UN treaties on human rights: the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These treaties have divided human rights into these two groups or categories. States considered these two groups of rights to be of a different nature. Civil and political rights were considered to be the classic freedom rights. These rights should ensure that people are free to live, act, and express themselves without the state interfering or stopping them. So these rights imply what we call negative state obligations, requiring the state not to interfere. Examples are the right not to be tortured, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. Economic, social, and cultural rights were considered to be rights related to social issues. For these rights, states must take active steps. In other words, they have positive obligations. Examples are the right to work, the right to education, and the right to health. Because states may not be able to provide for all of these immediately, they may take some time and can implement these rights progressively. The idea of progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights is, however, not a license for states to do nothing or very little. States have to use the maximum of their available resources and take measures that as quickly as possible ensure the full realization of these rights. Moreover, states should always, no matter the level of economic, political, or social development, respect what is called the minimum core of the rights. Protection of at least that minimum core of human rights prevents that these rights would remain empty and lose all meaning, or the raison d'être. Part of this minimum core are the principles of equality and non-discrimination. They apply immediately and always, and should be protected and promoted for all human rights. The division into groups or categories of human rights is mainly caused by the existence of the two treaties. In fact, we should not make such a strict division between the two groups of rights. Civil and political rights not only demand states to refrain from action, they may also require the state to act. And vice versa, economic, social, and cultural rights may also require states not to interfere. Let me give you some examples. In the first place, I would like to mention the right to vote. This is a civil and political right, which means that people should be free to vote for whomever they want. So the state should not interfere and respect the freedom to vote. But the state should also take action to organize the elections, including the setting up of ballot stations, ballot papers, counting systems, etc. Another civil and political right that requires substantial state action is the right to a fair trial. While this right forms part of civil and political rights, it cannot be enjoyed without significant state action, including the setting up of a justice system and courts, as well as the training of lawyers and judges. Examples from the group of economic, social and cultural rights are the rights to education and health. These rights require the state to establish education and health facilities and services, but these rights also mean that the state should respect the freedom of parents and children to choose their education, and the freedom of everyone to decide on their health and on treatment. In other words, human rights imply negative as well as positive state obligations. In fact, all human rights imply, broadly speaking, 3 types of obligations: to respect, to protect, and to fulfill. First, the obligation to respect. This is the negative obligation, implying that states should respect human rights and should not violate human rights themselves. Second, the obligation to protect. This is a positive obligation of states to protect individuals and groups from violations of their rights by other private actors. Such private actors could be other individuals, companies, or private institutions. Via national laws, such as criminal law and private law, the state should prevent human rights violations between private actors. Third, the obligation to fulfill. This implies that states have positive obligations to take action and adopt laws and policies to protect, promote, and facilitate the enjoyment of all human rights. States have legal obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. However, a person's ability to enjoy their human rights also depends on other people respecting those rights. Individuals should exercise their rights with consideration of the rights of other people. Some human rights are absolute, such as the right not to be tortured and freedom from slavery. But most human rights cannot be enjoyed unlimitedly. States may limit human rights under certain circumstances, for instance to protect the rights of others or a societal interest, such as health or public order. This means that, for instance, the right of freedom of expression does not allow people to incite hatred or violence. Another example we see now in times of COVID-19, where our freedom of movement, but also the freedom to manifest religion, the right to education, are restricted in order to protect the rights to life and health of people and of society. This also shows that all human rights are interdependent and interrelated. Human rights form a package, a whole. The right to freedom of expression is closely linked, for instance, to the right to education. The rights to health and life are clearly interconnected. Human rights are not about picking and choosing. They should all be respected and protected. And they should be respected and protected for all. Equality and non-discrimination are not only rights in themselves, they are also principles that underpin all other human rights. All rights should be implemented in a non-discriminatory way. But equality does not mean that we're all the same and should always be treated the same. It means that we all have equal rights. And that means that equal situations should be treated equally, but also that unequal situations should be treated unequally. Some human rights may not apply to everyone. Children or certain groups of migrants are not allowed to vote, for instance. Not everyone is entitled to a right to social security. Certain individuals or communities may also need different protection and measures in order to enjoy the same rights as others. For instance, persons with disabilities may need special measures in order to have access to education or healthcare. People from ethnic or linguistic minorities may need special measures to have equal access to election processes or to a fair trial. The body of human rights continues to grow. New instruments are being adopted, new rights are being proposed. This is because human rights instruments that were adopted more than 50 years ago may not reflect the current situations and current issues in the world. In other words, human rights law is not static or fixed, and it is not finished. Also, new actors are considered as possibly having obligations for human rights. For instance, there's increasing agreement that companies should also respect and promote human rights. And the scope of human rights norms themselves has been enlarged. Existing human rights are often formulated in a broad manner. Their scope is, via interpretation by states and courts, enlarged to cover new situations. For example, freedom of expression and the right to privacy are now also covering our activities on the internet. And the right to family life now covers all kinds of relationships and forms of families, including unmarried couples, families with children from earlier relationships, and same-sex couples. Apart from enlarging the scope of existing rights, new human rights are being developed. This is because there are worldwide problems that are considered not to be sufficiently covered by existing human rights. Therefore, the right to development and the right to a clean environment were established. The elaboration of these rights is closely linked to other international efforts to tackle worldwide problems. In September 2015, the representatives of 193 states unanimously adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. At the heart of this agenda are the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. These are 17 goals with 169 targets that address transnational issues facing the international community, such as poverty, access to healthcare, sustainable economic growth, a better living environment, climate change, security, and human rights. Central in the SDGs is the goal to leave no one behind and the worldwide reduction of inequalities. Clearly, the SDGs are closely connected to human rights. Promoting the SDGs is essential to the achievement of human rights, and human rights are essential to successful development processes. We should, however, not forget that the SDGs are a set of aspirations to which states have committed themselves, but they are not legally binding. Human rights treaties are legally binding and imply legal obligations for states. All right. We've come at the end of Lecture 1. In this lecture, I have introduced to you the concept of human rights. We've seen which human rights exist, where we can find them, and what obligations they may bring. We've also seen that human rights law is not a finished project, but that it continues to be further developed. This short overview provides you with a basic introduction to human rights that allows you to continue with the next lectures.